Hi everyone, welcome back to this AZ-900 Azure Fundamentals training. If this series is helping you learn Azure, please like this video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next lessons. In the previous lessons, you learned about Azure architecture and core services. We covered compute services like virtual machines, app service, containers, and functions. Storage services like blob, disk, files, and queues. Networking basics like virtual networks, subnets, VPN, and ExpressRoute. And the main database options in Azure. In this new playlist, we will focus on management, governance, and security in Azure. In this lesson, we will start with one of the most important topics: identity and access management. By the end of this video, you will be able to explain what Microsoft Entra ID, formerly known as Azure Active Directory, is. Understand the difference between authentication and authorization. Describe role-based access control, or RBAC, in Azure. Recognize typical AZ-900 scenarios for identity and access. Here is what we will cover in this lesson. First, we will review the basic ideas of identity, authentication, and authorization. Second, we will introduce Microsoft Entra ID as Azure's cloud identity service. Third, we will talk about users, groups, and service principals in Entra ID. Fourth, we will explain Azure Role-Based Access Control, or RBAC, including scopes and common built-in roles. Finally, we will look at exam-style scenarios that combine these concepts. Let's start with the basics. In any IT environment, an identity is an object that represents a user, application, or device. Authentication answers the question, who are you? It is the process of verifying an identity. For example, by using a password, a certificate, or multi-factor authentication. Authorization answers the question, what are you allowed to do? It is the process of granting or denying access to resources based on permissions or roles. In Azure, these concepts are implemented mainly through Microsoft Entra ID for identity, and RBAC for controlling what identities can do with Azure resources. Now, let's talk about Microsoft Entra ID. Microsoft Entra ID, previously called Azure Active Directory, is Microsoft's cloud-based identity and access management service. It provides a central directory of users, groups, applications, and devices. Authentication for users signing into Azure, Microsoft 365, and many SaaS applications. Single sign-on, so users can sign in once and access multiple applications. Support for multi-factor authentication, or MFA. Features like conditional access to enforce policies based on conditions such as user, device, location, or risk. Every Azure subscription is associated with a Microsoft Entra tenant, which is the dedicated instance of the Entra ID service for an organization. Let's look at some key identity types in Microsoft Entra ID. First, user accounts. These represent human users. They can be created directly in Entra ID, or synchronized from an on-premises Active Directory environment. Second, groups. Groups allow you to manage permissions for many users at once. Instead of assigning access to each user individually, you assign it to a group, and users inherit that access as group members. Third, service principals and managed identities. These represent applications or services that need to authenticate to Azure without using a human user account. Service principals are identities for applications, and managed identities are special types of identities that Azure manages automatically for services like virtual machines and app service. So you don't need to store credentials in code. In AZ-900 exam questions, if you see a scenario about how users sign into Azure, how to centralize identities for Microsoft 365 in Azure, or how to use single sign-on or MFA, you should think of Microsoft Entra ID as the answer. If you see a scenario about how an application authenticates to Azure without storing secrets in code, you should think about managed identities or service principals in Entra ID. Now let's move to authorization in Azure. which is handled mainly by Role-Based Access Control, or RBAC. Azure RBAC is a system that allows you to control who can do what on which resources in Azure. In RBAC, you assign a security principal, such as a user, group, service principal, or managed identity. A role, which defines a set of permissions. A scope, which defines where those permissions apply. The scope can be a management group, a subscription, a resource group, a specific resource. Permissions assigned at a higher scope are inherited by lower scopes. For example, if a user is assigned a role at the subscription level, that role applies to all resource groups and resources in that subscription. This allows you to control access globally, per project, or per individual resource, depending on your needs. Azure includes many built-in roles. For AZ-900, the most important ones to remember are: Owner has full access to resources, including the right to delegate access to others. Contributor can create and manage resources, but cannot grant access to others. Reader can view resources, but cannot make changes. User Access Administrator can manage access for other users, but does not necessarily have full permissions on the resources themselves. You can also create custom roles when built-in roles do not fit your needs. But for AZ-900, understanding the main built-in roles is usually enough. Here is an example that combines Microsoft Entra ID and RBAC. Imagine you have a team of developers who need to manage resources inside a specific resource group in Azure, but you do not want to give them more access than necessary. First, you create or identify a group in Microsoft Entra ID for these developers. Then, you assign the contributor role to that group at the resource group scope. As a result, all users in the group can create and manage resources in that resource group. None of them can grant access to others, because they are not owners or user access administrators. The access is limited to that resource group and does not affect other resource groups or subscriptions. This is a good example of using Entra ID for identity and groups, and RBAC for authorization and access control. From an AZ-900 exam perspective, it is important to recognize whether a question is about identity or access. If the question focuses on where users are stored, how they sign in, single sign-on, multi-factor authentication, centralized identity for Azure and Microsoft 365, then the answer is usually Microsoft Entra ID. If the question focuses on what actions a user or group can perform on Azure resources, assigning roles at subscription, resource group, or resource level, controlling who can create, modify, or delete resources, then the answer is usually RBAC and role assignments. Let's recap what you learned in this lesson. You learned that identity is about representing users, groups, applications, and devices. Authentication answers, who are you? And authorization answers, what are you allowed to do? You saw that Microsoft Entra ID, Azure AD, is the cloud-based identity and access management service for Azure and Microsoft 365. Providing users, groups, service principals, managed identities, single sign-on, and MFA. You learned that Azure RBAC is used to control access to Azure resources by assigning roles to security principals at different scopes, from management group down to individual resources. You also reviewed the main built-in roles: owner, contributor, reader, and user access administrator, and saw how Entra ID and RBAC work together in practical scenarios. These concepts are essential for managing secure and well-governed environments in Azure. If this lesson helped you, please like this video and subscribe to the channel to support the content and to follow the next lessons in this AZ-900 series. In the upcoming videos, we will explore network security, cost management, governance tools, and monitoring, so you can complete your preparation for the AZ-900 exam. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.